Hey everyone, if you've ever had to sit through hours of mandatory workplace training and thought to yourself, literally, what was the point of that? Well, you are definitely in the right place. Today's explainer is going to completely rethink everything we know about corporate training. We're unpacking a really provocative but honestly super practical framework by Guy W. Wallace. It's called the Cult of Performance in Enterprise L&D. And we're going to explore how to radically transform the way organizations approach training, moving away from just churning out endless content and toward actually driving measurable impact back on the job.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll start with the kind of counterintuitive idea. It is not about learning. Then we'll get into what the cult of performance actually means, followed by a pretty stark warning about something called content drift. After that, we'll look at the structural solution, architecting true performance, and finally, the practical path to competence.
Let's just dive right into Section 1. It is not about learning. Which I know sounds crazy for a training explainer, right?
There's a quote from the source material that hit me like a ton of bricks. It says, "It's not all about learning, it's all about performance." Think about that for a second. Even if you pride yourself on being a learning organization, this is a massive wake-up call. For years, the default mindset in enterprise L&D has been all about creating or curating content for people to memorize. But the ultimate goal shouldn't be learning just for learning's sake. The actual goal is to enable learners to achieve performance competence when they get back to their desks. If the instruction doesn't directly translate to better performance, it's honestly just wasted effort.
There's a really clear contrast between two main approaches here. On one side, we have a topic orientation. This is your classic, generic, out-of-context training that just tells you about a subject, abstract skills, general behaviors, that sort of thing. But on the other side, we have a performance orientation. This is about providing actual performance guides or experiences that are directly tied to what the learner genuinely has to do. It's all about application in a specific business context. The paradigm shift we have to make is crystal clear. We need to move entirely away from topics and strictly orient toward performance.
All right, moving into Section 2, the cult of performance. Why use such an intense word like cult?
To really get this, we actually have to take a quick trip back to 1978. I found this historical context absolutely fascinating. Tom Gilbert, in his classic book, Human Competence, warned the industry about what he called the cult of behaviors. Gilbert made the argument that in training, behaviors were way too often treated as the ultimate end goal, rather than just the means to an end. Behaviors are just enablers, right? They change depending on the situation. The true end goal is the performance itself. So, by claiming the term the cult of performance, this framework is making a direct, deliberate nod back to Gilbert's challenge. It's demanding that we focus on actual results, not just the actions.
So, we need to define exactly what we're aiming for here. Performance competence is, quote, the ability to perform tasks to produce outputs to stakeholder requirements. It is incredibly rigorous. It's not just about keeping busy doing tasks, it's about producing real outputs. And those outputs have to meet the specific requirements of the stakeholders, whether that's management, customers, whoever. That is the gold standard we need to strive for with every single initiative. Forget just tracking attendance metrics, right? This is what actually matters.
But getting there is tough. Which brings us to Section 3, beware of content drift. This is probably the biggest modern trap in corporate learning today.
This trap is content drift. Basically, it's the dangerous slide from the essential content needed to do a job straight into extraneous content. Why does this happen? Well, usually it's because the people writing the training aren't totally sure what specific performance they're trying to enable, so they just throw everything at the wall. They add nice-to-know background history, complex theoretical models, you name it, and the result? Complete cognitive overload. By giving the learner more content, you actually inhibit their learning. You make it so much harder for them to remember the critical things they actually need to do on the job.
And honestly, this warning has never been more urgent. The source material makes a really stark observation here. Now that generative AI makes it much easier to source content than ever, it's more critical that content be screened and the extraneous content extracted. I mean, AI is an incredible tool, but let's be real, it's a content generation machine. It can instantly spit out pages of plausible, well-written, but completely extraneous fluff. We have to be fiercely protective of our learners' time and cognitive load. The instruction should always be as short as possible, but as long as necessary to achieve that performance competence.
So, how do we fix this overload? That's Section 4, architecting true performance.
The solution requires a structured framework that breaks the whole process into two distinct steps. Step 1 is instructional architecture. Think of this as the macro design. Before you even think about building a single course, you design modular performance development paths.
You figure out what you already have, and you identify the gaps. Then, step 2 is instructional development. This is the micro-design phase where you actually build or acquire the specific content. The big problem in most organizations? They completely skip the architecture phase and jump straight into development. They do these bottom-up, one-off projects, which inevitably leads to massive gaps, overlapping content, and super inconsistent messaging.
When you actually apply this macro design approach, you get a concrete system, like the 5-tier enterprise content architecture framework. By organizing your content into these modular tiers, starting from broad organizational orientations all the way down to unique, specific how-tos, you make it incredibly easy to reuse content. You design it once, and you reuse it across different learning paths. This gets rid of those frustrating one-off gaps and overlaps. It creates a streamlined, logical journey for the learner, instead of just a chaotic pile of isolated training modules.
All right, for our final step, let's look at Section 5, the path to competence. This is where the rubber meets the road.
Getting this right takes some very specific real-world practices. First, you want to start with a project steering team made up of no-nonsense, business-oriented leaders. That ensures your training actually aligns with business results. Then, stop guessing. Elicit your data directly from master performers, the people who are already doing the job flawlessly. Bring them together in facilitated group processes to rapidly figure out the required tasks and outputs. Next, divide and conquer the work so you can speed up your analysis and design. And finally, run rigorous 2-part pilot tests. Use your target audience, sure, but also bring in additional master performers who weren't part of the design phase. These practices are what keep you tethered to reality rather than floating off into the theoretical clouds.
Now, as you consider all these philosophies and processes, I want to leave you with a deeply pragmatic piece of advice from the source material. Adopt what you can and adapt the rest. Because let's face it, no single framework is going to fit every single organization perfectly right out of the box. You have to be a critical thinker here. Take the performance-based tools, the models, the language we've talked about today, adopt the parts that seamlessly fit into your corporate culture, and intelligently adapt the parts that need a little tweaking to make sure they actually work in your specific environment.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I've got a challenge for you. Will you join the cult of performance? Are you willing to commit to abandoning the bloated, topic-based training of the past? Will you challenge yourself to relentlessly focus on what people actually need to do on the job to produce outputs that satisfy stakeholders? Because if you can make that pivot, you won't just be delivering training anymore, you'll be driving true, measurable business impact. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and remember, keep focusing on performance.